do the practical. In preparing this talk for today, I was thinking about the most useful contribution I could make to this discussion as a curator who's been actively involved in the acquisition of Iranian contemporary art and modern art for an encyclopedic museum, and as a Qaj art historian who can possibly explore the subject of likeness and difference and the confines of the modern within a larger historical context. This conference couldn't have come at a more timely, in a more timely fashion with the opening of such shows here in New York as Iran Modern at Asia Society, Iranian art from the Great Art Gallery at New York University, and a constellation of shows in galleries in Chelsea and Tribeca. Let us begin with the question of continuity. I would like to say that, and this is probably not new but important, that modern Iranian art cannot simply be interpreted as a continuation of art produced in the 19th and early 20th century. And although no art is produced in a vacuum, and there's always bound to be some element of continuity, when it comes to non-Western modernisms, there's often a break, a sort of rupture with the pre-modern. In other words, one did not necessarily develop out of the other. And during the 60s and 70s, Iranian artists were exposed to Western modernism through travel, study abroad, texts, artworks, and this heightened awareness served as a catalyst for producing new forms of expression and content. So I would like to suggest that Western modernism was a catalyst rather than a model. And another matter I would like to emphasize is that the movement away from realism, which was so typical of the late 19th century, toward an abstract aesthetic need not be equated with a pull toward a Western sensibility. A tendency towards abstraction, thus, must be interpreted as a mere adaptation, must not be interpreted as a mere adaptation of a Western convention, and abstraction as a concept is not necessarily a Western phenomenon. A tendency towards abstraction and minimalism in Iranian art can be traced to the early years of the Islamic era and has indigenous roots within the native visual repertoire of Iran itself. Abstraction, especially in calligraphy, for example, is largely a result of its wide use as surface ornament on works in different media, including paper, as well as on architectural surfaces. One of the distinguishing characteristics of the Arabic script is, in fact, its adaptability to the various surfaces it covers. The same is true also of the so-called arabesque and geometric surface ornament. Both are abstractions and essentialized expressions of vegetation and forms found in nature. This point is vividly illustrated in a Turkoman folio of abstract calligraphy from 15th century Iran or Iraq in the Topkapi Palace Library. This work has been discussed by the late Oleg Grabar in his seminal book, The Mediation of Ornament, in a chapter on the intermediary of writing in Islamic art. It is an assemblage of lines in 6 colors rotating around a central pivotal point over a red ground although not apparent at first, it contains a Shiite invocation, the Shiite invocation, Ya Ali, rotated 4 times and depicted in one of the colors that is used, one of the 4 colors that is used. So to its patron and to its maker, it was a deeply spiritual, devotional work, but to our Western eye, it might remind us of Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie, which was produced in 1942. So the penchant for abstraction is also seen in Iranian architecture from the medieval period through the 17th period and beyond, as seen in this abstract panel from a carved stucco panel from the shrine of Pir Bakran in Linjan, and also a panel from the Masjid Shah in Isfahan that was under the Safavids. And so you can see this penchant for abstraction quite a lot. So let's move to the Qajar period. By the second half of the 19th century, the Qajar ruler Nasir-ud-Din Shah and his successors had by the second half of the 19th century, under the Qajar ruler Nasir-ud-Din Shah, the act of emulation was not only considered key to the artistic process, but a highly prized quality. Copying the work of Renaissance masters and other European academic painters was integrated into the curriculum of the Dar al-Funun, Iran's first institution of higher learning, and works of such masters such as Abul Hassan Ghaffari, his uncle Muhammad Ghaffari, known as Kamal al-Mulk, Ali Akbar Mozayyin-ud-Dawla, and Abu Turab reflect an almost obsessive relationship with realism, verisimilitude and a desire to visually measure up to European models. Producing the likeness of a personage or a landscape was considered among the most esteemed qualities of an artist. This explains the reason for the ascendancy of portraiture over all other art forms at the time. Qajar artists were in the service of the court. They were tasked with producing portraits of the rulers, their families, and their extended court. Their works were intended as visual records of history, and their ultimate objective was to glorify the court, its surroundings, and its accomplishments. This explains the appointment of such master painters such as Abul Hassan Ghaffari as painting instructor at Dar al-Funun and chief editor of the state newspaper Ruzname Vaqai Ittifaqiyeh and other newspapers. The paintings of Muhammad Ghaffari are also largely consist of royal portraits, and sources of the period refer to painting as a science. And although quite stunning, many of the portraits, like these, exhibit a somewhat mechanical quality. In the same way that the works of the Iranian modernist was a rejection of what preceded, Qajar artists moved away from the traditional miniature painting. However, when looking closely, we see many aspects of classical Persian miniature carrying over, such as absence of perspective, light and shade, volume, and the expression of psychological reality of a subject. But ironically, one aspect that is most noticeable is the same attention to surface decoration on architecture and on the garments. Historical sources such as travel journals and memoirs contain many references to the Qajar admiration for European realistic portraiture and the preoccupation with producing replicas. The act of copying and producing faithful replicas of Western portraits was entangled with a greater quest to be modern and Western, and a reflection of a larger syndrome. The insecurity on the part of Iranians at the time about their geopolitical position in relation to the two great powers, Britain and Russia. So in copying European works, Qajar artists believed that they were placing themselves on equal footing with the West. Artists who were capable of producing flawless copies of European paintings were handsomely rewarded. For example, Nasruddin Shah reportedly once asked one of his court painters, Mehdi Musawwir al-Mulk, to paint a replica of a painting by an Austrian artist that he had brought back from Europe, so that he could not distinguish the replica from the original. The introduction of, this is work by Kamal al-Mulk, and portraits in the newspaper Sharaf, one of the portraits of the American ambassador Benjamin. The introduction of photography further intensified the artist's fascination with realism in the same sense. In fact, in his memoirs, Mohammad Hassan Khan, Etemad al-Sultan Nasruddin Shah's Minister of Publication, stated that from the time the science of photography was introduced in Iran, it has served the art of painting and portraiture immensely. So there is also ample evidence that many portrait paintings and lithographs of the late 19th century were direct copies of daguerreotype photographs. Ferishte Daftari's stimulating essay in the publication, The Catalogue of Iran Modern, illustrates this point by juxtaposing an image of Kamal al-Mulk's painting of Nasruddin Shah and the Talar Aine with that of Gauguin's What Goupil. She discusses how each painter looks to the artistic tradition of the other. Kamal al-Mulk to the Western academic painting and photography, and Gauguin to Persian miniature painting. Now let's turn to the concept of modernism, and the advent of modernism in Europe was, as discussed by many, a Western phenomenon, but its encounter with the art of non-Western cultures is undeniable. But each non-Western culture, however, follows its own trajectory in its quest for modernism. Western modernism served as a catalyst for the creation of a new and relevant category of art in Iran in the 60s called the Saqakhane movement. These artists mined the local popular culture of the masses to formulate a new artistic vocabulary, and they looked inward at their own cultural milieu to create the art with a distinct national identity. And many were inspired by the paraphernalia used in Shiite religious rituals, such as metal grills from shrines, water fountains commemorating the Battle of Karbala, standards, and mundane objects of daily use. And this is explored at length in the exhibition at the Asia Society. They drew from the culture of the underprivileged masses, and others looked at their pre-Islamic heritage for inspiration. But regardless of content, the result was a body of work that was at once Iranian, modern, and cosmopolitan. It was a unique synthesis of the three, often tinged with biting social and political commentary. Now I would like to briefly talk about a few issues that I've been grappling with as someone who's been collecting Iranian modern art for an Islamic collection of an encyclopedic museum, and has had to help formulate a rationale for collecting, and that's how that comes into play. One important criteria has been resonance with works in the collection, in the permanent collection, the historic collection. In other words, the belief that a proposed work should have some meaningful connection with works, themes, ideas examined by the works in the permanent collection. So launching a new program of collecting also requires a strong conviction in the idea that production of great non-Western art did not end in the 19th century, and that modern contemporary art from these regions is not derivative and not a lesser version of art produced in the West, and thus worthwhile collecting, which has not been thinking in the past always. And of course, with any proposed work, acquisition, a work must be of high aesthetic merit and in good condition, fairly good condition. Now, using works from our collection, I will talk briefly about three artists' works representing three generations: Marco Gregorian, Shiraze Hushiari, and Ali Bani Sad. Gregorian, one of the pioneers of the movement that is of the Saqakhane movement, and is considered one of the pillars of early modernism in Iran. Hushiari sort of represents a group of well-established and renowned artists working outside of Iran who have been active in the 80s and 90s. And lastly, Ali Bani Sad represents a generation of young, talented artists with an international reputation. Each one of these artists negotiates and navigates the notions under discussion here differently, and in each generation the equation of factors such as likeness, difference, modernism varies. A close study of this cross-section of artists also reveals a multiplicity of voices and self-perceptions and a poignant collection, however subtle, with the culture of their homeland. One artist who perfectly balances the modern and the Iranian, producing works that are both cosmopolitan and Iranian at the core, is Marco Gregorian, who was an Armenian-Iranian born in Russia, living in Iran, studying in Rome, and spent many years in New York. So if anybody's cosmopolitan, he is. He was one of the primary organizers also of several biennales in Tehran. We recently acquired two of his abstract earthworks for the collection, which and I will show you one. These are quintessentially modern in approach and composition, but unmistakably Persian in material and content. His compositions are intimately connected with village life in Iran and utilize the basic materials, including straw, sand, and mud, which are used to build the adobe-like dwellings and everyday utilitarian objects. They express his passion for the simplicity and beauty of life in Iranian villages. This composition, which is currently on display in the Iran Modern exhibition, consists of a typically unfinished meal of an Iranian worker, the Dizi Abgush. This is like a three-dimensional still life celebrating the life of the Iranian worker, farmer, villager. It is an antithesis of the work of one of the Qajar artists we saw, like Abul Hassan Ghaffari or Kamal al-Mulk. Another artist from this early period who is a world-renowned public artist is Siah Armajani, and he had been active since the mid-50s and spent the first 20 years of his life in Iran. And during these years, Armajani became very involved in politics, and his early works show this. They are fresh, spontaneous, and truly timeless. They too celebrate the culture and of the Iranian masses. This one is called Shirt 2. He transforms the lining of his father's suit jacket, an intimate and emotionally charged object, into a talismanic shirt. This work, is covered with poems, songs, and texts from subversive political handouts or shabnames. In a conversation with the artist, he told me that he was fascinated with the culture of the people who lived in the underprivileged areas of Tehran, and enjoyed watching fortune tellers warding off bad omens by scribbling spells on bits of cloth. And it is important to know that he is now a very famous public artist, and it would be interesting to see the bridge between these early works and the later works. The second artist, I'm running out of time, is Shirazeh Hushiari, who was born in Iran and moved to London and has been working in London. Her work explores her interest in Sufism and the poetry of Rumi. And the origins of the works are calligraphy implemented in graphite and repeated into luminous surface of the canvas. Her work is labor-intensive and fuses the undecipherable word and the canvas into a meditative visual experience. Although deeply personal and meditative, her work speaks a universal language, and embodies a universal message. It is about the very essence of our existence, our breath, our heartbeat, our presence. Human presence is represented here by light and illusions of pulsating rhythm. This work, entitled String in the Met's collection, is made of pencil, pigments, and acrylic and aluminum. Here, 3 gyrating forms of interconnected gray fibers emanate from the dark blue field, and at the center of each there is a puncture by a black or white spot. As in many of her works, Shirazeh started with a crosshatch rendition of 2 Persian words to generate the delicate pulsating web pattern seen here. And the word is then obscured by the repetition so that the viewer cannot decipher their meaning with the naked eye. According to her, it is like something coming into existence out of nothing, and where the web has been punctured, there is an absence of breath. Now I want to move along. The last work I am going to talk about is Interrogation by the young artist Ali Banisad. His work is a response to war, particularly the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 88, which he lived through as a child before leaving Iran and settling in the United States. His paintings are visual representations of the horrific sounds of war, of bombs, sirens, etc. And his visual and narrative content is multivalent. It stems from his exposure to Persian miniature painting, pop culture, cinema, graphic novels, and European painting. His apocalyptic paintings make subtle references to monumental expanses of a 15th century Dutch painter, Hieronymus Bosch, and I just want to move along. And his large panoramic canvases contain layers upon layers of vigorous brushstroke that explode like shrapnel from an unnamed place and detonate before our eyes. They thrust us into this chaotic field where conflict in any case, what I would like to just mention that there is a relationship here with the vigorous brushstroke, and if you look very closely, there are figures that come out, and the more you look, the more you see, and there's this sort of underworld in his paintings, and that's what is really the focus of and sort of what he's doing and the beauty of his work. And he has said that he's been inspired by Persian miniature paintings, particularly battle paintings, because the two are interesting in that both of them have an underlying logic. They're chaotic, they're battles, they're full of action, well, sort of, but at the same time there's an underlying logic. And the Shahnameh paintings particularly show, you know, how a battle can be beautiful and not disturbing and actually pleasing. And how this is rendered in a miniature painting. I think he draws inspiration from that. So I just wanted to end by saying that the works discussed above show an ongoing dialogue and negotiation with modernism, local, universal, personal, and national. Each artist is working within a different historical context and is immersed in a distinct cultural milieu. Time, place, context plays a crucial role in the final alignment of these variables. So I leave it up to you to answer how Iranian are these works. But more importantly, I will leave you with a question. How do we, as educators or curators, communicate their complexity to our readers and to our audiences?
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. I think